Hi, and thank you for joining us today to learn more about climate. I'm Lucy Noble, and I've dedicated the past 11 years of my career in reducing greenhouse gas emission by shifting users to more sustainable travel modes. And now I want to bring awareness to environmental issues and the urgent need to address climate change. I'll be talking to experts in this field and sharing key insights in bite-sized pieces with you. Today, we're talking to Kevin Kwok. From grassroots farming in Mali, West Africa, to France, to chairing stages on ESG, climate, and responsible AI. Kevin's 15-year journey has been intertwined with sustainability and finance. His roles as board advisor for Omal Brands, head of ESG divisions at HSBC Investment Banking, and MSCI showcases his commitment to creating positive environmental and social impact. He is a United Nations ECOSOC representative for the National Peace Corps Association, aligning the org with Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. Kevin also serves as a mentor to entrepreneurs at the Clinton Foundation with ventures that impact communities around the world. Hi, and welcome, Kevin.
Hello. Thank you for the invite. I'm really excited to talk about climate today.
Yeah, so tell us, why are you interested in climate?
Yeah, so it's interesting. It actually naturally evolved for me. I think most of the people that you see in the space saw it as a career opportunity to really grow in their professional development. But for me, it was really just the love of nature. I almost even joined this thing called Future Farmers of America, and at even one point, I majored specifically in botany. So I was a bit of a green thumb. I saw firsthand abroad when I lived in West Africa that we only know so much from what we read. So
Mhm.
over the past decade, thinking about West Africa, Sahel, which is where I live, the vast majority of the region is semi-arid grasslands that lie south of the Sahara Desert. And it really affects about 17 different countries around that region. And temperature rises, temperature is about to rise about 1.5 times the international average. So imagine your life over there when it's primarily focused on agriculture as the main source of income in a desert. So we tend to focus solely on our own country and other developed countries, but really thinking about emerging and frontier markets and how much support they need to counter the damage that's caused by us. And really thinking also about how we have the whole initiative by 2050 to reach net zero. But honestly, sometimes when I think really in depth, like net zero, to me, it's just the beginning. It will eventually create complacency with a lot of alternative solutions rather than the pure focus on absolute carbon reduction and other greenhouse gases.
Thank you for that. Yeah, we all have to be a little bit more aware of all of this, and that's why we're putting all this podcast together so we can all learn more. And so, how did you get into this field? I know you're an expert in ESG investing. Can you take us to a quick journey of how you landed where you landed?
Yeah, it was a pretty interesting journey. And eventually, I graduated from undergrad with economics. I went into structured finance at a global bank, and then all of a sudden, this mortgage crisis happened. So this was a little bit like, I guess, like 15 years ago. And I ended up moving into the strategy team to rebuild and re-envision how a new era of finance would look like. And I did a lot of great things there, but eventually I wanted to do something more impactful and something more at the grassroots level. So I joined the Peace Corps. I
Mhm.
worked with farmers, I worked with women's cooperatives, I worked with local tailors, and I even taught myself how to build a solar power system to power lights for a night literacy class for adults. And I remember the moment I finished and I turned on the lights for the class, there was a big applause. It was actually one of the proudest moments of my life. And eventually, something happened. We had Al Qaeda activity in the north and also a coup d'etat in the south. And eventually, we had to be evacuated. I made my way also to France, and I did some organic farming over there for a month. And I'm originally from Texas, so I always tell people, what do you do in Texas? You gotta work in energy. So I ended up going back to America and working in energy private equity. And honestly, That was probably one of the best decisions I ever made. I learned so much about the foundations of energy, especially from the exploration and production side, and how important energy is to our entire society. I also learned about the byproducts that come from fossil fuels and how intertwined that is to all of us. It also becomes more complex, right? And as we discuss energy transition, it's become one of the hottest topics of the decade. I eventually moved to S&P in the energy practice to New York, and it's the largest credit ratings provider in the world. And I was coined the non-traditional finance guy. And S&P was one of the early signatories to the United Nations Principle for Responsible Investments. And this was only about 8 years ago. So no one in my division, so these are like thousands of credit analysts, none of them have ever heard of ESG. And because of my background, I was one of the first members of the ESG steering committee at S&P, really just trying to understand how to integrate ESG risks and climate into credit risk itself. So thinking about bonds and loans and debt in general. And fast forward a few years, I went on to head ESG and fixed income at MSCI, which is the largest ESG ratings firm in the world. And I worked alongside the top 100 global asset managers and asset owners. And then I also went to head the ESG advisory practice at HSBC's investment banking and capital financing division in the Americas. And this was also looking into the ESG impact on valuation and IPOs and M&As, and also capital structuring for sustainability-linked loans and bonds.
Wow, what an impressive background. I love it. And I love that you had such a heartwarming story of building the solar panels with the kids. And again, you're right about when you're in Texas, you're working in energy, because we have another interview with my friend Cindy, who's in Texas as well. And she also worked in energy. So we'll hear from her as well. So ESG investing, what is it? I think a lot of our listeners, like you said, may not know about what ESG is. What does it mean, and why should investors be aware of ESG? What do we need to know about ESG investing?
Yeah, so ESG investing, thinking about what the terminology, there's not a lot of standardization, and there's a lot of confusion oftentimes when we talk about ESG investing and sustainable investing, and they can be slightly different. Sometimes they're kind of used in the same as the same phrase. So
Mhm.
ESG investing, we often say it's the environmental, the social governance risks and opportunities, and really how that can be considered material impact to companies' performance. And that's where the popularity of ESG ratings and scores come in. But I always say, take those ratings and scores also with a grain of salt. They're not all equal in meaning, because there's multiple providers out there these days. And also, when you're comparing companies, each industry has their own set of ESG risks, for instance, and it's not necessarily fair to compare them. So if you think of like a Google or a Meta, their ESG risks and performance to that of like a Ford Motors or a General Motors. So one is in technology, interactive media and services, and the other one is auto manufacturing. Very different industries, so always make sure to when you're looking into sustainability goals and ESG risks, to also be fair to compare to their comparable industries. And then when you think about sustainable investing, oftentimes a lot of people will talk about SRI, or socially responsible investing, or even impact investing. That's about positive social change or environmental change, and not necessarily putting a huge emphasis on financial returns at that point. It's more of secondary consideration, and it's more about the moral values and thinking about that way. And recently, actually last year, I was asked by the head of sustainable fixed income at Bloomberg to write a chapter on ESG data, ratings, and indexes. And really, in the end, it was me sitting down with so many top asset owners and asset managers in their investment committees, and understanding that each company and firm really has a different priority and mission to their stakeholders. So really understanding all that really makes a difference in investing.
Thank you for explaining what that is. And you mentioned like the ESG and SRI has a particular rating. And so, if someone's in, a tech company where they're not manufacturing anything, the rating might be a little bit higher than if they're a manufacturing company or, in fossil fuels or something like that. So the rating is like more straightforward and it's not like, pre-weighted based on if they're doing manufacturing or not. So we have to, as a consumer, place that into consideration ourselves when we're looking at these ratings. Is that correct?
Yeah, so and depending on the ESG rating or scores you look at as well, they will align with materiality risks as well. So thinking about like a Google or a Meta, first and foremost, you'll be thinking about privacy and data security, labor management, talent in terms of like engineers and like STEM type of talent as well. And when you're thinking about something like a auto manufacturer, you definitely are thinking about raw materials, energy consumption and usage, water stress, and recycling. Because like as you were just mentioning as well, when you think about like a tech company that's more on the service side, they're not necessarily the ones at the beginning stages. They're actually the ones consuming. So for them, they'll be more cautious about the electricity that they purchase. And then also if a company like Google or Meta has actual physical products, they're typically outsourcing their manufacturing to other places, and they'll be more of like a scope 3 at that point. Where if you look at a Ford Motors or a General Motors, you're looking at scope 1 and 2 for them for their manufacturing and energy usage.
Mm-hmm. Great. And with your background in all these fossil fuel organizations and your experience, working in the industry while you were in Texas, what is your perspective for their long-term strategy for fossil fuel organizations?
Yeah, it's always very difficult to talk about this, especially in this type of era where I still do believe oil and gas industries have a place here, where it's an important role in the actual energy transition. It still does provide affordable and reliable energy needed to fuel the what we call like the fair growth and improved life conditions. But at the same time, we do need to decrease our emissions to support the net zero world. That's a given. So if you look at technology over the past 50 years, oil and gas companies have become more safe and more efficient, but the main issue isn't that, it's more the global energy consumption. So really thinking about it, global energy consumption is actually I think it's almost expected to grow at least by 2/3 through 2050. So it's really going to outpace our efficiencies that we had gained from all the efforts that we've done through energy transition. So we continue to also have population growth. We have increased manufacturing. And one of the main differences also is we have higher living standards these days. So really thinking about where our energy comes from. So utility companies traditionally also had coal generation assets and also fossil fuel divisions, but you see them slowly divesting away because for them, as a power generation, they don't necessarily need those assets. They can always rely on the exploration and production side for the actual sources. And when you think about the difference between like an Exxon or a Chevron and your local utility company, so utility companies are still, you know, they're the power generation stage, and even states like Texas, when you think about oil and gas, I think most people are also very shocked to find that Texas actually has the largest wind farm capacity in the U.S., and I think it's about 40 gigawatts.
Wow, I didn't know that Texas had the largest wind farm. So thanks for sharing that. And yeah, you're right, because everyone has, higher standard of living, we're producing a lot more. The global energy consumption is increasing, which affects all of us. And there's also a lot of companies working on renewable and green energy. And so for those innovators, how can they be working with fossil fuel organizations as well? They're like more the traditional energy.
Yeah, I think this is probably one of those age-old questions we probably hear every generation, but for every, for different industries, like how can these organizations work together? And it sounds easy, but it's also about asking ourselves, what are we willing to sacrifice? Although we're in this world where we've been pushing renewables, like what consumers don't realize is it hasn't really been profitable for quite a long time, and it requires a lot of subsidies to be economical. And although now we're seeing better margins in renewables, oil and gas companies are still more profitable. And yes, they also have subsidies, which also can make the industry more complacent. And the world has this expectation that oil and gas needs to transition to clean energy on their own dime. And to me, that doesn't always quite make sense, but it sometimes makes sense to those in the eyes of the consumers who villainize fossil fuels or the climate activists. And I always ask or say, so then don't use the energy, right? And it's not that easy. So I've lived in a village in West Africa for a year and a half, and I had the simplest life. Most first world countries can't even live without luxury or energy for 24 hours. And we definitely need government support. So the Inflation Reduction Act last year will actually provide much more support with about $380 billion injected into investments, and it'll focus on energy infrastructure and climate reform. And we talk a lot about EVs, so electrical vehicles in this world, but there isn't the proper infrastructure for it to be efficient just yet. Even thinking about the late 19th century and early 20th century, thinking about like cars and horses, right? Cars began to become more popular as it became more affordable and practical, and that's what we had to think about. And the transition was also influenced by different factors like better roads, mass production of automobiles, and even introduction of gasoline as fuel sources. So it's a similar concept. We need to think of a better way to change, and also how do we charge these EVs in the future? So whether it's through charging stations or other methods, better battery storage technology is also something we need to look into. And also what other fuels to generate the power needed to charge these EVs, because energy doesn't come out of thin air. It has to come from somewhere.
hmm So you mentioned not to villainize the fossil fuel companies. Do you think we should continue to invest in them in terms of like helping them, transition to more green and renewable source? Or are you saying like because we still depend highly on that and the investor return is so much higher with fossil fuels that, what's your perspective on all of that?
Yeah, that's always a very difficult question where I've actually had discussions with endowments in the past as well. So think of the Ivy League endowments out there where they asked me, what can they do also? Because they had a lot of issues in the past 5 years, if you've seen, where students and faculty were protesting against the endowments investing in fossil fuels, and they wanted divestments. But at the same time, they came out with a very quick language saying, we're going to divest today. But then they came back to me and said, wait a minute, we can't just divest. And I said, exactly. It has to be a slow transition. So what you've seen now with a lot of large asset managers and even the endowments is they've changed their language slightly and said, we will no longer invest in new oil and gas projects. So they're talking about the new ones out there rather than just saying we're going to divest from all, because it's hard to just divest when energy is still such a important part of our lives. And you, me, and just thinking about friends and family, it's important for our livelihood.
hmm And are you seeing trends where investors are investing less? Like, so when you're looking at investors who are concerned with ESG investing or SRI ratings, are they looking at funds that there's less or no fossil fuel investing? Or do you see the trend is, like you said, they're just not investing in new ones?
Mhm. Yeah, so of all the asset managers and asset owners I met around the world, everyone has a very different mission. So you have the ones out there that will be looking at companies and saying, okay, as long as you are transitioning, so if they're looking at their research and development revenue percentage in terms of like expenditures to fund these types of new innovations, they'll be looking at that. And then you have these other types of investors out there that say, we will not invest in anything what we call sin stocks. So they'll be talking about fossil fuels, alcohol, weapons, nuclear. So very specific types of missions that they have. So everyone is a very different type of investor. And I think in order to truly transition to a clean energy economy, we have to help the transition. So, a lot of it also is, as like a stakeholder or investor, is pushing these oil and gas companies to invest in more technological advances in clean tech. And at the same time, it's also about them pushing also more funding towards their venture side. And I've been seeing that a lot more at the oil and gas side is they have their own venture funds now that focus on clean energy technology. And it's because they know it's inevitable, but it's more how hard can they be pushed, and also how hard can the consumers look at themselves and say, I also have to control my own energy consumption to really support their transition.
That's great to hear that some of these companies are starting to make that transition or have been making that transition. Is there a place where we can find whether companies are doing that, or if there's a commitment that they've made? Is there like a general investment site that you recommend?
I mean, there probably are databases out there, but I don't
Mhm.
know if there's specific sites that would point them out. But obviously, if you look into any sustainability report, they would definitely happily talk about their positive impacts in the world, right?
Mhm.
Typically, they would talk about their R&D percentage in clean technology. And even when you're looking at asset owners and asset managers, their whole mission statement, they will be very explicit about their focus on infrastructure development, clean energy innovations, and investments. So, there's a lot of good information on the specific websites of these companies as well and investors.
Great, thank you. I'll take a look.
Mhm.
And to wrap up, do you have any final advice for our listeners or any call to action for investors out there?
Yeah, I think the most important thing for me and for everyone is just to continue to educate yourself. I, there are times where I'm a bit disappointed when I hear people pointing fingers based off of biased information. So we're all influenced by our own experiences, but understanding all sides is really important. Coming from the oil and gas industry, I've been told by climate activists that, I'm evil. I'm like, with me? I'm like, I started questioning myself, right? And so I end up asking people if they could stop driving. Can they stop using their electricity at home today? Can you stop buying electronics? Can you stop wearing those clothes that you buy? And it's funny because they often get offended and they say, what? I can't do that. I need those to survive. But we need to divest oil and gas today. And then as the conversations go on, then that's when I realize, although they have good intentions for the world, they're really no better than who they blame. And they're only contributing to the problems, right? And as an investor and working with other investors across the world, consumers have the power to stop consumption and make the change. And voicing an opinion is not the same as taking action. So understand the foundations of energy, understand the life cycle of your products and what we call the cradle to grave. I'm always conscious about spreading my opinion without all the fundamental information, because what I learned myself is sustainability and climate is continuously evolving because our human consumption patterns are also changing and technological advances are also disrupting. So we naturally want to protect our own family and our friends, but along the way, what I realize is we're also one of the biggest hypocrites, right, in our battle against climate change. So I always say, don't just talk the talk, walk the walk. And I always say this to everyone everywhere I go, and I say, what is sustainable today is not necessarily sustainable tomorrow as well. I could go on and talk all day about the good and the bad of EV, solar panels, and wind turbines, and they're great, but there also are negative side effects to it too. And we'll leave that for the audience to ponder. So, but purely blaming energy industries for climate is almost like saying you're blaming farmers for obesity sometimes. And it's funny to think that way. But there's
Mhm.
no doubt that we need to transition to a cleaner energy economy, but we all, including us as individuals, need to work together. But the listeners can definitely reach out if they want more discussions as well.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it is definitely a very complex topic and a very complex economy that we live in and work in. And it's a complex global economy that we live and work in. And so
Yeah.
really appreciate your time here talking to us about it and giving this awesome and great advice. So we'll talk to you again next time. And to our audience, thank you for listening. And if there's another topic around climate change that you're interested in or curious about, shoot us a message and we will help align those speakers and experts and share more. So let's get together and explore solutions and take action for a healthier planet. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you again, Kevin, for that very insightful discussion. And to our audience, if there's another topic that you're interested in exploring around climate change, please leave a comment below. Your input helps shape future episodes. And don't forget to subscribe and join next week for a more insightful discussion. Together, let's explore solutions and take action for a healthier planet.